There are many things that will come into our life that are like storms, like a raging tempest that comes through with high winds and moves things out of order, causes chaos and destruction. And sometimes those storms will keep coming through until they've taught us what we need to learn from it. There is always something beautiful behind it, as difficult as it is to go through. And that is something that I recently went through. About a week ago, we actually had a storm come through very close to the town that we're staying in. So close that the tornado sirens started going off, and we went and took shelter in the stairwell, and it was really ominous and creepy how the tornado sirens were going off and you could hear the wind whipping so strong outside, and the rain was just pouring down like in sheets. It was plummeting against the building and it was terrifying. And just before that happened, I had a fear, or I should say a terrible experience of the past come back again because I had failed a test of my faith. Living like we have had to live on total faith in God's promise financially also meant total surrender to His plans, His ways, His timing. And there were times where God only sent enough to cover the bare necessities, like the room fee or the food that we needed. And I had to just submit and surrender to God's plans. And so my car had gone behind a little again, and God had given me a promise that I wouldn't lose my car. So that promise was tested, because that's what happens before the fulfillment. We're tested on our faith and whether or not we trust God or we trust the fear. So that promise was tested. And I had a situation where there was a tow truck that showed up in a hotel parking lot, and I did not even think twice. I ran down to the parking lot and got in my car and left, and I was so afraid. I acted out of complete fear instead of faith and trust and quietness. I reacted so anxiously that it put me on the other side of that spiritual fence of protection that I have shared with before. And those that haven't heard that post, there's one of the videos on here. It's about the fence of protection. And when we do things out of fear-inspired thoughts and movements, we come out of the protection of God. Because the promises, they only work when we're in His will and we're in obedience and we're in a place of faith and trust. And I had went outside of that boundary zone a few times, and I went through some really hard, painful lessons. So the next day, after I reacted out of complete and utter distrust in God and out of fear, my car was towed away. And I can't even tell you how terrifying it is, because we're in another state. I didn't have like a rich uncle to call or someone I could call in case of an emergency. We had nowhere to go. The hotel we stay at is not walkable. There'd be nowhere to go. And so it's so much more scarier without a car. And so I had lost my car. And then right after that, we went through a literal tornado. And my faith was tested, and God met me during the howling winds and the raging storm that was coming through my life. And He gave me a promise that He would cover the room, because our room was due. It was only covered for till the end of the week. And He gave me this beautiful encounter in the night. And in the night, me and my daughter were floating in a hot air balloon. And we were up really high, so we were falling because I started to look down, and that's what happens when you're in faith. You start to come back to the ground where you get hurt, and we were falling really fast and really far. I remember going over the mountaintops, and the whole time I was praying, God, please don't let us get hurt. It was so scary, and I felt so helpless. And then just before we reached the ground, right above it, we miraculously just clipped to a tree, and then under the balloon was a whole bunch of beautiful butterflies, which God always symbolically speaks to me as miracles. And God showed me a promise through that encounter that He would save us just in time, and it would be a gentle landing. So I knew God had a promise for me that He would save us. But I was also facing the fears of what if. Because this isn't the first time this has happened. When we very first started this journey, the very, very beginning 8 years ago, I had taken me and my 2 daughters to a hotel in a city in a state I'd never been to before, with no lifeline, nobody to help me. And I had only my promise and my encounters from God that He would support us. And I remember things didn't go as I had hoped, and my faith was just baby size, so I didn't have the kind of strength to just soar like an eagle. And the time came where we ran out of time and no money showed up, and I had to check out of the hotel, and we had no car. And I remember we had to go to the dumpster behind the hotel and just throw a lot of our things away. And then I had enough left for an Uber. There was nowhere to walk to. There had been nowhere to go. And I thought, well, I remember hearing about the Ronald McDonald homes that they had, and I knew there was some issues going on at the time that I didn't know if they were anything. They turned out not to be, but I had nowhere to go, and I knew in the hospital there was a room for families, so we took an Uber. We could only carry 2 bags each of us, and we went to the hospital, and we sat on that hospital bench. And I remember my kids just looking at me where are we going to go now? And I didn't know where I even was. I'd never been there before. I didn't know where anything was. I didn't know anybody. And I felt so afraid and so helpless. And so we went up to the hotel room, or the hospital floor that had a room for families, and we sat in there for 12 hours. But I knew we didn't have much longer. I could sense that door was closing, so we ended up getting rescued out of that. I mean, it ended up being in a really disappointing way, a very painful way. And I still held on to that memory as my anger towards God for making or allowing me to go through that pain and that disappointment. And I held on to that as self-protection. I'm going to remember what you did to me, and I'm going to hold it in my heart, and I'm going to hold it here so that you never forget. And so I never forget. So like holding that wound was a self-protection. And since then, God's lifted us and carried us to beautiful places, different states. We've been in homes, apartments, hotels. God's been so faithful and loving. And, it's so normal to hold on to that one bad memory and just make nothing of all the good memories. And it's kind of it's exactly what I was doing. Instead of thinking in my time of crisis of all the miracles that God's done, all the promises He's fulfilled. He's fulfilled more promises for us than I can even record. I can't even keep up with it all at this point. So instead of doing that, I remembered that time where I felt like God wasn't there. And even though we did get rescued, and so it was still a miracle, but it wasn't what I had hoped. And I was disappointed and I was hurt. And so from that memory, I started thinking, okay, I only have a few days left to pay the room. I have no car. I have nobody I know that could help me. So God made me this promise. He's always been faithful. But instead, I started making backup plans. I'm like, okay, we could leave some things in the room and just abandon them because there's no other choice, and we could go just find somewhere in the woods to hide, find a tree to make friends with. I couldn't even think of a backup plan, to be honest. There was no other option but a miracle. But all that time I was doing that, I was making us crash to the ground. Because it's really simple. When God gives us a promise, all we have to do is believe. And that means resting. To put an anchor in the ocean to keep the ship in sail, or to keep it in place. The anchor has to hold, and that's what we have to do with our thoughts. We have to hold them in the promise and not go back and forth between fear and faith. And I failed miserably, and things got scary, and I was having full-blown panic at that point because I only had 3 days left until the room was due. I had no car. God kept showing me and encouraging me that He would show up to fulfill the promise. But I was terrified at that point, and I was too weary to try to rise back up again. I didn't have the energy to come back. And then last night, as the icing to the cake of all the fear and pain I went through, it was like I went through this encounter. It's very hard to put into words that wouldn't be taken out of context or used against me. So I'll just say I went through the grief of a death. And the death, the grief hurt so much. And the death was my promise. And it was like I could see the person, and she had killed herself. And I wasn't letting myself think about it because I don't deal with death right away as a person. My heart blocks it. I have only lost a couple people in my life, but when I do, it doesn't hit me till weeks later. And that's what I did in the encounter. I was trying not to think about the fact that I just killed my promise just killed itself. But in the encounter, it was a person that I loved deeply, and she killed herself. And then all of a sudden, God showed up and was holding my hands and saying that the promise was brought back to life, that Jesus brought my promise back to life. But He said, no more self-protection, no more thinking those thoughts of fear and backup plans. And it was like a very stern order, as if I was receiving direct orders from the judge at the court. And So my promise was resurrected in that encounter, and God gave me very direct orders of what I was expected to do. The next morning I wake up, and God had also that night given me letters for a new love letter to write, and I was writing this love letter, which I posted today, which goes perfectly with this story, so if you get a chance to read it, it's called Embrace the Unbelievable. I had the biggest surprise show up out of nowhere. Like, it was so fast, it was startling, and I was able to pay my room and pay to get my car back. And God saved us. And after that happened, and after I paid my car and paid my room, it was like a roller coaster of emotions I had to go through, because I felt like I had just survived a natural disaster. I was feeling overwhelming gratitude to the point where I couldn't stop crying, and the shock that I almost died, and relief beyond explanation. I cannot explain the relief that I felt. I could finally breathe. The fear was gone. I was comforted, and once again, I met God. Just as there are consequences to what we eat and how it can harm our health, there are consequences to what we think about, because if it's channeled through faith or if it's channeled through fear, it can directly change the outcome of things. When we act and think from a place of fear, for one, we step out of the protection of God, and we can potentially kill our promises so that they don't happen. And the hardest thing, I think, and the thing that I learned the most, is we just have to get out of the way and make ourselves small and make God's promise over every fear and doubt, and just accept it simply, like a little child. You just believe, and you just let go of every fear and doubt, and you make God bigger than the problem, bigger than the impossible way it looks, bigger than all the doubts, bigger than all the fears, bigger than the feelings that are trying to beg for our attention, bigger than the past memories and the past disappointments. I wanted to share that with you. And I pray whatever you're believing God for, that He would help you to trust Him and take Him at His word. And that every part of you that is experiencing pain from past memories, that you would be able to let go of that and release it. You know, sometimes we want to yell at the storm and be angry, but we can't control there's things that storms come, natural disasters happen, and getting mad at the storm isn't going to do anything. We just have to sometimes weather the storm, take shelter, and God is our safe house, and those who trust and hope in Him will not be disappointed and will not be hurt. You can trust God when He knows those that are trusting in Him and those that are taking refuge in Him. And that kind of faith is so beautiful and precious, and He will be your refuge in this storm. And what I love the most is that He gives us so many chances to learn and to try again during this last journey, which started in July. This is the third time I've failed this test, and yet God saved me because He gave me grace. We're not perfect, and He knows that, and we're just learning about His ever-present love and learning to trust Him. And trust comes from experience, especially with those of us who have went through abuse, even since childhood. after that kind of abuse, there needs to be a lot of love and comfort and trust, just something that comes through experience and choice. We have to make a choice to trust. If we don't make the choice to trust, then we're keeping ourselves closed off to even experiencing the goodness of God. I love you so much, and thanks for listening to this update. If you'd like to find out more about the story, it's at diamondsfromthedust.com. There are love letters and faith posts and all kinds of resources there for you. Have a wonderful evening.